Hey, y'all, welcome to Geek Freaks. I am Frank, and today I'm with Barry Lyga, author of many books, 27 books, including Thanos, Titan Consumed, a series of flash books. We got Wolverine Worst Day, and of course, I Hunt Killers. How are you doing, Barry?
I am doing great, Frank. Thanks for having me.
Of course. Can you tell us a little bit about your writing career? I would love to know. You started off, in Yale, you started in comics, and then you shifted over to writing so many books. What was that like going from comic books to novels?
Yeah, I mean, the writing was always there from the beginning. It was there before the comics. It was there before Yale. I wanted to be a writer since I was 6 or 7 years old. It just took me a
Mhm.
really, really long time to figure out how to make it work,
Yeah.
and to get good enough. It's like anything else; you got to work at it. And so when I got out of college, I went and worked in the comic book industry because I love comic books. I mean,
Of course.
I'm an enormous comic book geek, so I worked in the comic book industry, and I wrote some pretty terrible comics while I was in the comic book industry. And then one day I had this idea. I wanted to publish books, but I wasn't sure what I was going to do. And I'd written a couple books that nobody wanted to publish, of course. And then I had this idea for a book based on my own childhood about a kid who loved comics and was bullied for it, and goes to a comic book convention to meet his heroes and comes away a little disappointed.
Mhm.
And I called it The Astonishing Adventures of Fanboy and Goth Girl. And it was this ridiculous title, which I thought, well, nobody's going to publish it anyway, so it doesn't matter what the title is. And wouldn't you know it, that's the book that got me published. That's the one where a bunch of publishers fought over it, and there was a bidding war and an auction and all that. And that book came out in 2006. And I've just been too stupid to stop ever since. I've been doing it ever since. So yeah, it's a 27 books out so far, and I just sold the 28th a little while ago, and I think we're coming up on maybe selling 29 and 30 as well. So the people who don't like me, sorry, I'm going to be around for a while.
Oh well, they better get on
Yeah,
board. There's something common there, like with your Wolverine book too. That's through the perspective. I think it was a 13-year-old
yeah,
who is basically at Xavier's school, outcast, not really figuring out how to be X-Men, but tells the stories of Wolverine, their hero.
right.
Is there something that you find endearing about these characters that are kind of observing heroes from the outside?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. People have been asking me for years, like, okay, you've written all these books and they're all very different. I mean, I've done serial killer books and coming of age
Mhm.
books and literary novels and science fiction. I've done everything. And people say, well, is there a common thread throughout them? And I didn't think there was until one day I was at a high school giving a talk, and a kid said, well, I've noticed all of your books are about outsiders. And I was
Yeah.
like, well, damn, yeah, yeah, kid, you got it. Like, and I guess because for most of my childhood, most of my teen years, I felt like an outsider. And that's one of those things that sticks with you. And I also think outsiders typically have a really interesting perspective on
Yep.
what's going on. If you've ever been the only sober person in a room of drunk people, you kind of know, like, you observe things that nobody else observes, and you see things and learn things. And I find that interesting. So that's always been something that's there. And I think in particular, in the case of Wolverine Worst Day Ever, Marvel came to me and said, hey, could you write a book for young readers that introduces them to Wolverine? And I said, yeah, I think I could do that. And I like this idea. The X-Men are outsiders, outcasts in a world that hates and fears them. And I thought, what's it
Mhm.
like to be an outsider among the outsiders,
Yeah.
and to have that perspective? So I came up with Nowhere Boy, whose mutant power is the ability to not be nobody notices him. That's his power. The world's suckiest mutant power. Nobody notices him, and that gives him a perspective on the X-Men that other people wouldn't have.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think there's so many kids out there who would see themselves in these characters, and then that makes them really attached to them and find hope through them and stuff like that. So,
I think
uh,
I think adults too. I think there
oh,
are a lot of
absolutely,
adults who feel that way too. Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah. So when you started off in the comic book industry, what from that did you pull forward into your current writing career?
Well, I mean, I have ended up doing a lot of comic book or comic book adjacent stuff, even in my writing career. Like I said, my first novel was about a kid who worships Brian Michael Bendis,
Yeah,
and is
smart kid.
trying to create his own graphic novel and wants to show it to Bendis at a comic book convention. So there was that I brought in. And then obviously, the Flash books that I wrote, the Thanos book, the Wolverine book, that brought stuff in. But I think, for me too, there's something about the pacing of a comic book that I brought in. and also this idea that you don't have to be one kind of writer.
Right.
Comic book writers, have a guy write Batman and then write, you know, I don't know, Doctor Strange, or
Mhm.
look at that. My favorite contemporary comic book writer is Mark Waid. Um, Look at all the different kinds of stories Mark has told over his
Yes.
career. He could have just been the Flash guy. He could have just been the I love the Silver Age guy. But no, he gave us Irredeemable. He gave us Ruse when he was at CrossGen. I could go on. Potter's Field was a really great, interesting, weird mystery series, and I really took that in, and I really took that lesson to heart. That you don't just have to tell one kind of story, even in one particular comic book. Look at Alan Moore's run on Swamp Thing back in the day. I'm an old man,
Right.
so all my comic book references are from the 80s.
The
But
classics.
you look at Alan Moore's Swamp Thing back in the day, and one issue he's fighting the Floronic Man. Okay, that's a
Mhm.
superhero story. And then another issue is just one of his tubers falls off in the swamp, and a guy eats it and has a hallucinogenic experience, and that's 22 pages of just bizarre acid trip. And that's all in the same comic, related to the same character. And I really learned from that you can just it's all about the story. Don't let these ideas of genre or these norms hem you in. Just tell a good story and people will respond.
Yeah. And then that transcends into some of your more, I would say, adult content with I Hunt Killers. We have the trilogy and we have a prequel that just came out. What was that like shifting from, not necessarily shifting, but you have superheroes over here, but then you have serial killers over there.
Yeah.
What is that like writing that difference?
To me, this is such an unsatisfying answer. There's no difference. There's no
Yeah.
transition. It's all just me, and
Yeah.
and I feel as at home and as comfortable writing one as I do the other. I think people were sort of surprised. I have to go back several years at this point because this series came out a while ago. But when I
Mhm.
Had Killers was announced, people kind of went, "Wait, Barry Lyga, the guy who wrote Fanboy and Goth Girl, is writing a serial killer story?" And
Yeah.
now I'm so well known for that serial killer story that if I do something that isn't dark and creepy and gritty and violent, people go, "Wait, Barry Lyga is writing something that's comedic,"
Yeah.
because they can't wrap their head around that. But to me, it's all the same thing to me. Like I said, it's all finding a cool story to tell and then telling it to the best of my ability.
When it comes to the characters, how do you make a character so sympathetic or even likable when his dad's a serial killer, though? Like that seems like such a challenge for you.
There again, I sort of go to the outsider thing.
Oh,
The
okay. Yeah.
Who Jasper Dent, nicknamed Jazz, who is the main character in the I Hunt Killers stories. He grew up with his father wanting to raise him in the family business. His dad raised him to be a serial killer, and so when you drive home what that really means to the reader,
Mhm.
most readers will immediately go, "Oh my God, this poor guy!"
Yeah.
His dad was taking him along on murders when he was 10 years old and showing him, well, boy, this is how put on your gloves and make sure you get the bleach and do this. And, that immediately makes a reader go, oh my God, this poor guy.
Mhm.
And then you can play with that because then the character has the reader's sympathy. And then when the character does something a little twisted and a little messed up, it really catches the reader off guard and makes
Yeah.
the reader go, wait a minute, maybe this guy's more messed up than I thought. Maybe I should be wary of this character.
Has there been in of all your, what we're at now, almost 30 books? Has there been anything that's been a real difficult challenge for you that maybe was just so far out of your norm that you had to sit back and think about it?
Yeah, honestly, when I sat down to write I Hunt Killers, it was the first time I was writing for publication from a third person point of view. My other books had all been
Okay.
first person, and I decided that this is a thriller, and I want to be able to cut away from the main character sometimes to maintain tension. And that took a second for me to go, wait a minute. Wait a minute. I mean, it's not like I didn't know how to do it, but it was a
Right.
mind shift for me. And another thing I can think of, and your listeners might find this funny, I'm a huge comic book geek and I love the characters and I love Superman in particular. And
Mhm.
I got to the point in my Flash series where I got to write Superman. I knew Superman
Yeah.
was going to be in book 5 of the Flash series. And I sat down to start and I froze up and I've been writing Flash and all these other characters, Green Arrow and all these other guys for a while. I just froze up. I was like, because this is Superman,
Yeah.
And I remember I emailed Mark Wade and I said, Mark, I'm freaking out, man. I'm about to write Superman. I'm going to put words in Superman's mouth and I'm freaking out. What do I do? And he was so kind and so sweet. And he emailed me back. He said, look, he goes, you got this. You know the character. You love the character. There's nothing I can tell you about Superman that you don't already know. And then he proceeded to do like a page and a half of like the perfect graduate level course in Superman. Here's how I see Superman. Here's how I think of him. Here's how I tell his story. And it was just a condensed like nugget of Plutonian goodness. Oh, and I read it, and then at the very end, he goes, "But again, you don't need any of that because you've got this. You're fine. Go do it." And I was like, and it was so sweet of him to take the time to do that. And it just helped. You know, it helped me to get past my, oh my God, I'm writing Superman. And go ahead and do it. And I wrote Superman, and I think I did okay with it. So yeah.
I think you need to frame that email from Mark, and that's amazing.
I should do something with it. Yeah.
That is so cool. Let's talk about the Flash series. So did you work hand in hand with CW for this? Because it's inspired by the CW version of Flash.
Yeah. It was funny. You know, I got a call from the publisher at Abrams Books, who was a guy named Andrew Smith, who I'd known for years. And he said to me, look, you know, we just signed a deal with Warner Brothers to do a series of books based on the Flash TV show. And I said, what do I have to pay you to be the writer? And he said, no, we'll pay you because the Superman is up there, but the Flash is probably my favorite comic book character. And he said, no, we'll pay you. You can do it. And it was funny because originally I was trying to tie it in with the show. That was the plan, that it was going to tie in with the show. And with the very first book, we realized that with the pace that the show moved at, and the pace that publishing moves at, it wasn't going to work to tie them together. And that was when Andrew came up with this great idea. He said, what if the books are set in an alternate timeline where Barry never went back in time at the end of season 2 to create Flashpoint? What if instead the story just picks up from the end of season 2 as if Flashpoint never happened? And CW was like, that sounds really cool, actually. Yeah. And so that made me realize I had my own version of the DC universe then, where I could do whatever I wanted because I wasn't beholden. All I was beholden to were the first 2 seasons of the show. Other than that, I could do whatever I wanted. And it wouldn't affect the show. And so I had a lot of fun with that. And I did work with them. I mean, they read everything that I wrote and they approved every word that went on the page. I will say they had very little that they asked me not to do. They were very, very willing to let me, I think they trusted me. And they were really willing to let me go hog wild. I think the only thing that they wouldn't let me do, there were 2 things. One, they didn't want me to use H.R. Wells, which was the version of Harrison Wells who dies at the end of season 3. And I thought, well, in my version, he wouldn't have died, so he could still be around. So, and I liked the character, so I wrote him into one of the books, and they said, you know, could you just not use him because, you know, and I'm like, that's fine. So I used him in a flashback, and then just said he went off to find himself in the world, you know. Yeah. And then the other thing was I kept trying to sneak Green Lantern into the book.
Oh man.
Because I really like Green Lantern, so I kept, and they haven't used him on the show, and I kept trying to sneak him in. And I don't know why, because I used a lot of characters they didn't use on the show. I mean, a ton of characters, but for some reason, Green Lantern, they were like, no, just don't. And I'm like, okay. And then I tried to sneak him in again. No, don't. So, but you know, that's okay. Considering what they let me get away with. I mean, I got to use the Legion of Superheroes. I got to use the Crime Syndicate of America. I got to use Antimatter Man from an old 70s Justice League story. I mean, considering the things I got to do, I can't really complain that they said, please don't use Green Lantern. So, yeah.
First off, then that puts you in this whole mind space. Like, were they planning on using a Green Lantern on their own at some point?
I mean, I know that at the time there was a lot of talk about Greg Berlanti doing a Green Lantern show. And so maybe that was it. But again, like, I was using all kinds of other characters that weren't on the show. And it was an alternate timeline, so it didn't really matter. I don't know why that was just a thing. Maybe somebody said at some point, hey, let's not use Green Lantern anywhere. And it just filtered down. And then everybody was just like, we're just not going to use Green Lantern. So I don't know.
What is the most outlandish character that you were able to use?
I mean, for me personally, I had I showed the origin of Bouncing Boy in book 3 with the dialogue lifted right from the 1960s era adventure comics, where I showed his origin, and that seemed ridiculous to me that I did that, but I did, and but wow, I mean, there were so many characters. I love the Crime Syndicate. If you could see my shelf back there, I've got all the Crime Syndicate figures, the original like Earth 3 pre-crisis Crime
Yeah.
Syndicate. I got to use them, and that was a lot of fun. It was fun to use the Phantom Stranger.
Oh wow.
Yeah, and I just literally had him like show up in a couple of books, and like nobody knew who he was, and they were just like, "Oh, it's a guy in a cape and a hat," and then he walks away.
Yeah.
And then at the very last book, I had him introduce the story the way that he used to introduce stories back in the Bronze Age, where there would be a splash page of him saying, introducing what was about to happen and say, I know these things for I am a stranger, and then he would walk away. And I did that in the book. Probably the craziest thing I did was I used Ambush Bug. I introduced the Flash version of Ambush Bug, which to this day I cannot believe nobody said, Barry, no, do not do that. But I did it, and I had him going whoop, 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 and I had him teleporting places, and I even did like in the old Ambush Bug things, it was all metafiction. He would like talk to Keith Giffen like in the comics, and I had him he was talking to me in the book.
My God.
Yeah. And that's probably the craziest thing I did. And at that point, I think honestly, I was just showing off. Like I knew they trusted me. I knew they would let me do whatever I wanted. And I'm like, okay, fanboys, here you go. I'm going to use Ambush Bug. So yeah, that was a lot of fun.
That's gotta be a blast to try to find something, these little nuggets, and bring them back. Like to me, I always want someone to try to make Condiment King cool. Like I'd love he's always the punching bag. I would love for somebody to try to take a serious take on him and just see what that would look like, Yeah.
I mean, I always Jerry Conway, this was very sweet. I didn't know Jerry at all before he said this, but he got a hold of these Flash books of mine and he read them and he posted it online. He said, as far as I'm concerned, the best superhero prose out there is Barry Lyga's Flash books. And he said, you can tell reading them that he doesn't take himself seriously, but he takes the work very seriously. Oh, wow. And I was like, you know what? That's like the nicest thing you could say to an author, I think.
Yeah.
And it felt really good to have him say that, especially somebody whose work I admire so much. And that's sort of how I felt about it. I was like, let me find all these things I love about the DC universe and find a way to use them in these stories. That's what it was. I mean, it was a love letter to these characters, I mean, because I've loved them since I was 5 years old and started reading comics.
Yeah. Now with Barry Allen, how did you capture his voice? And was there anything separate or different or unique that you wanted to add to your version of Barry Allen?
There were a couple things I wanted to do. I mean, I've always loved Barry Allen since I was a kid. I've loved The Flash. And one of the big things that I wanted to do was I really wanted to get into the head of somebody who's got this power. Mm-hmm. And I really spent a lot of time thinking about what is it like to perceive the world this way? And then I wanted to filter that through the science background. And I decided that these 6 books were going to be about science to some degree. I was always trying to put actual science in there. I mean, we've got like actual formulas in the books at certain points. At one point he thinks about morning dew, and there's a formula called the Magnuson formula that determines whether or not dew condenses in the morning. And so he thinks about that, and there's the formula right there.
That's cool.
And I wanted that, and I wanted, just to show like when you perceive the world this way, how does it change you? How do you think of things differently when you can move that quickly? And when you have the science background to understand exactly what it means that you can move that quickly. And then one of the things I did, this is just a pet peeve, this has always bothered me, when they show him picking somebody up and running with them.
Yeah.
That bugs the hell out of me. He doesn't have super strength. So I established that basically he just grabs them and drags them, and people don't like that. And so that was just my little pet peeve. that something, that something like that would happen. Um, but no, it was a real thrill to write that character and to write all the characters around him, and it was so much fun.
That series had such a good ensemble cast that I can't imagine like having fun with that dialogue and trying to make up new dialogue for them. That's gotta be a blast.
I mean, Cisco was a
Yes.
lot of fun because Cisco is us, right?
Yeah.
Cisco's a comic book geek.
Exactly.
And so Cisco was a lot of fun to write in that regard. And I got to have a moment where he ends up thrown through time and he ends up in the Wild West. And that was a lot. He got to meet Powell Smith and Madam 44, and that was just a lot of fun.
Oh man. Let's shift from Marvel or from DC to Marvel and talk about
Yeah.
Thanos Titan Consumed. Now, first off, how did you get involved with Marvel, and was it specifically meant as an MCU tie-in, or was this comic book standalone?
Yeah, I got a call one day from my agent. We were talking about something completely unrelated to Thanos, and then she was, oh, at the end of the conversation, she was, oh, and I almost forgot. I'm going to be talking to your publisher later because they have some project they want to ask you about. And I'm like, oh, okay, which is weird because that's not usually how it happens. Usually I write something and bring it to them.
Right.
But I went, oh, okay. And she goes, yeah, do you know what my agent is not into superheroes at all? And she goes, do you know what Thanos means? And I went, yeah. She goes, it's something about Thanos. And I'm like, okay, call him right now, please. I'd like to know
Right.
what this is.
Yeah.
And so I ended up talking to them, and they said, look, the studio has gotten in touch with us, and they said they've got this origin for Thanos, but they don't have room for it in the movie in Infinity War.
Right.
And so they want a book that will go into his origin and we'll tell his story that can come out after Infinity War, but before the next one. We didn't know it was called Endgame yet.
Right.
And I was like, oh, wow. And they say, is that something you could do? I'm like, hell yeah. So I signed roughly 500 NDAs. and then I talked to the studio, and they told me, the basic, I mean, the upshot of what you saw in Infinity War, which is, hey, I knew that things were going to go bad on Titan, and I tried to tell them and said, we got to kill 50% of us, and they thought I was crazy and kicked me out, and now and so now I've gone to do that for the whole universe, and that was basically what they gave me of for his origin, and I'm like, okay, like, well, that's not enough to make a book out of, so I need to go into more detail and explicate a little more. And I knew the character, obviously. And the difference between working with the studio and working with DC was like, hey, you're in your own timeline, just do whatever you want. Marvel was very much like, we don't want you using any other characters, because I was like, oh, I'll use Grandmaster, and I'll use the Collector, and this guy, I'll use all the space guys, and they were like, no. And I understand that because they weren't sure yet what they were going to do with those characters on the screen. And I could do something that would mess up a plan or something like that. So that was a little bit disappointing because, again, one of the reasons you like to do these things, these work for hire assignments, you don't get paid a huge amount. The
Right.
deal isn't that great. You do it because you love the world and you want to contribute to it. So I couldn't use, a Warlock or any of those characters that I would have used, but I got to make up my own characters, and I got to put words in Thanos's mouth, and I got to figure out how you get from. I always say, like, the story of Thanos isn't the story of a guy who decides he's going to kill half the universe. It's the story of a guy who goes, yeah, I have no choice. I have to kill half the universe, and not only is that the best idea, but I'm the guy to do it, and I know how. Like it's that ego leap. It's that ego leap from. I mean, we all sit around and BS and go, it would be great if somebody did blank. It's leap. It's that leap to, I'm going to do it, and I know how to do it. and to me, that was what I wanted to get at in the book was how does he get to that point? And that was a lot of fun. It was the deadline was insane. The deadline was absolutely insane. And of course, I couldn't tell anybody. Like, I had to keep it a secret for like 6 months. And all
Mhm.
my friends were like, "What are you working on?" And I'm like, "I can't tell you." um, and then the day came where I could tell them, and that was a lot of fun.
Yeah, those movies like were back to back too. There was not much room for play in between
Yeah,
Infinity War
yeah,
and Endgame, so I'm sure
yeah,
they had
yep,
you on a
yep,
pretty tight line.
yep, yep.
Now, how did you address bringing? Because unlike a normal comic book project or something like that, you're bringing in people who are from the comics or from a lot of content that's already out there. And in
Yeah,
this specific thing, you're bringing in people who probably have or might not have ever touched a comic book, who are excited
right.
about the movies and are
Yeah.
exploring. Is there anything you changed to kind of appeal to a broader audience?
Yeah, well, I didn't think of it as changing things to appeal to a broader audience so much as changing things to fit what we'd already seen on screen.
Yeah.
We knew, I mean, we comic book geeks have an idea in our head of who Thanos is from
Mhm.
Infinity Gauntlet and years of Jim Starlin stories and that kind of thing. Right down to the Thanos copter, right?
Of
Like, we
course,
have
I was waiting to say
all these.
it.
Believe me, if I could have gotten the copter in the book, I would have. Um, but we had all these things in mind, and those are things that people who've seen the movies only don't have in mind. All they know about Thanos is what they've seen in the movies. So I didn't want to have to rely on some any sort of specific comic book knowledge to carry the story. So really, for me, and the other thing too is this wasn't a comic book; it's a novel.
Right.
Comic books are really good at certain things and really bad at certain things, and books prose is really good at certain things and really bad at other things. And so I wanted to lean into the strengths of prose. And one of the deepest strengths that prose has is you can really get into the psyche of your characters.
Mhm.
You can get very, very deeply into the psyche. And that's what I wanted to do was really get into Thanos's head and really look at what makes this guy tick, what makes him think. And it's funny because there's stuff again, like I wrote I wrote this book before Infinity War came out. I hadn't seen Infinity War yet.
Yeah.
And so I was going based on the little scraps the studio gave me, and then what we'd all seen in the movies, and then what I came up with based on that. And then I remember sitting in the theater, the midnight showing of Infinity War, and going, I nailed it. This is like, I looked on the screen, I was like, this is my guy. Like,
Oh yeah.
right down to there's the bit at the end when he tells Thor, you should have gone for the head, right?
Yeah.
There's a bit at the end of my book where he tells Gamora she had killed some guy for him. She said you should have aimed for his head. And I wrote that.
Oh, so
I wrote
satisfying.
that. I wrote that a month before I saw Infinity War, and I
Yeah.
was like, I almost jumped up in the theater and went, "Yes, that's exactly right."
Oh, it's
People would have been
perfect.
like, "Who the hell is this guy?" So that was really satisfying to
Yeah.
see. That I as a writer, that was kind of cool that I'd managed to piece together the character correctly from the scraps that I had. Um, but that to me was the big thing, was getting into his head and figuring out not just not just the why of, oh, I'll kill half the universe, but the why of, this is why I'm going to do it. I'm
Yeah.
not going to leave it up to somebody else. I'm going to do it, and here's how I've got it planned out from step A to step Z.
That's such a good point because I think there's a lot of people who walked away from Infinity War and be like, well, Thanos isn't like fully wrong. Like there's definitely some things. And of course there's the classic thing of like, well, why don't you just snap and double all the resources then?
See, that bothers me. That always bothers me, and I have the answer to that, and I wish I'd put it in the book.
Mhm.
Um, but the answer is actually very simple, and any toddler can give you the answer, which is creation is harder than destruction.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that makes
Now,
sense.
he snaps his fingers at the end of Infinity War and kills half the universe, and he almost dies, right?
Right.
Like when you see him at the end of the movie, he like when you see him in Endgame, he's an old man. Like he's limping
Yeah.
along. The gauntlet is molded to his hand. Like he almost killed himself doing that. If he had tried to double the resources in the universe instead, he would have failed. He would have
Yeah.
failed horribly and been killed in the trying. So that to me is the answer.
Yeah.
And every time I see somebody say that, I go, no, 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 let me explain.
It's a classic Reddit, complaint,
Yeah.
that
Oh,
you
I
see
know,
all
I
the
know, I know.
time. All right. Well, the other thing I want to make, like, if we're going to be talking about comic books, we have to talk about Free Comic Book Day. You had
Sure.
a hand in developing this. Can you kind of tell the story on that one?
Yeah, yeah. A retailer, a store owner named Joe Field, who has a great store, Flying Colors Comics, out in the Bay Area. He noticed one day that Baskin Robbins every summer had a free scoop day, and he
Mhm.
noticed there were lines around the block, and they did a great business on that day. And he thought, what if we did free comics? And so he wrote this letter. This is children. This is back when there were magazines, and you wrote letters to the magazines. And he wrote this letter into Comics Retailer magazine, where he said, "Hey, as an industry, what if we did this?" And you have to understand too, this was like 2000 ish,
Mhm.
when comics were in a deep, deep hole.
Yeah.
And this is before the first Spider-Man movie came out. I mean, this was, it's a bad time for comics. He said, what if we did this? This could help our industry. And and I was working at Diamond Comic Distributors at the time. I was in the marketing department. And and I got called into the office of the VP of my department, and he said, "Hey, did you see Joe's letter in Comics Retailer?" I said, "Yeah." He goes, "You think that's a good idea?" I said, "I actually do. Like we've been saying for years, like the industry needs to do something, like as an
Right.
industry, and nobody's done anything. And yes, I think this is a fine thing to do." And he said, "All right, you're in charge. Make it happen."
Oh boy. Big project.
and and I said, "What's my budget?" And he said, "You don't have a budget." Um, so yeah, it was the operations side of Diamond was in charge of getting all the books together, and the purchasing side of Diamond was in charge of getting publishers on board. But as I like to say, Free Comic Book Day by its nature is a marketing event,
Right.
and it doesn't matter if the books exist if nobody goes into a store to get them.
Mhm.
So I spent the next 6 months of my life cold calling every human being I could think of who could possibly help get the word out, to make Free Comic Book Day happen. And by some miracle, it worked.
Yeah.
That first year, it was a success. People were really happy with it. And we all looked at each other and said, let's do it again. And this time I got a budget, not a very big one, not a very big one, mind you, but there was something at least. And I did it for 4 or 5 years, for the first 4 or 5 years before I
Hmm.
quit to focus on my writing. And there was a part of me that wanted it to fall apart after I left.
Yeah, of
you
course.
know,
Yeah, a little bit.
like
You're right.
you can't do that without me. Um,
Yeah.
but I'm really pleased. It just got bigger and bigger and bigger. I mean,
Right.
it got bigger and bigger, and and now I have kids, and every Free Comic Book Day, I take them to the comic book store, and I'm like, Daddy made this happen. They're like, whatever. But the people behind the counter are like, you're my hero, man. I'm like, see,
Yeah.
kids, see, Daddy does things. Um, so no, I think it is one of those things where, again, you know, as comic book people, we had always wanted the industry to do something, anything as an industry, not something that benefits DC or Marvel or the
Right.
indies, or something that benefits everybody, something that brings everybody together, something we can all agree on. And we found it, and it worked. And I hope it continues. With the Diamond bankruptcy and everything, I
Yeah.
don't know who will be in control of it, or anything like that. I'm hoping it continues past this year. We'll see.
Yeah. Now, I think a key with it was, taking down some of the barriers of accessibility for people interested in comic books. Is
Yeah.
there something you see that could also be removed as a barrier to comic books for the next generation of readers?
Yeah, for God's sake, stop recommending Watchmen to people.
Oh,
Sorry, sorry.
that's definitely not a new comic
That's
book reader book.
that is
Absolutely.
my pet peeve. That's been
Yeah.
my pet peeve for like 30 years. I love Watchmen. Like I bow to no
Yeah.
one in my admiration of Watchmen, but it is not for new readers.
No
Like you
way.
have to understand 50 years worth of superhero comics to understand what
Yeah.
they were doing in Watchmen. And it drives me up a wall. Um, but I think the biggest barriers have been the availability. I think you need more stores. I think the fact that I know this is difficult for my friends who own comic book stores to hear, but I think the fact that you've got a flowering e-comics industry, and the fact that you've got
Yeah.
graphic novels in Barnes and Noble and independent bookstores, I think that helps. I think it helps that stuff's in libraries, because a lot of people aren't going to go to a bespoke store, to pick
Mhm.
up something they don't even know if they're going to enjoy it. You need to get
Right.
people hooked first. People need to find that they're interested in it before you can tell them, did you know there's a special store just catering to this stuff? And if they're like, I've never read a comic book, why would I go to a comic book store? Um, start them off with, get them in with the other stuff. And then, hey, by the way, there are these great stores where they have everything you can imagine, and they can
Yeah.
tell you what you should read next. And
So
then
true.
eventually you can read this thing called Watchmen that, may or may not blow your mind.
Yeah.
We have to remind ourselves that thing is 40 years old at this point. It has issues now. But I think that's probably one of the biggest things. We also have to remember too that, a comic book's not going to be for everybody. There are some people, comics I actually did a whole study on this years ago. It is very complicated for some people to derive meaning from the synthesis of words and art at the same time.
Mhm.
Their brain just doesn't work that way. And they have a lot of difficulty, reading the word and getting meaning from the picture at the same time. These people are not stupid by any means. It's just everybody's brain works differently. And
Right.
there are some people who are going to look at a comic book and just go, this makes no sense to me. I don't understand why this is too much work, or it's just a mess. But I think and hope that, the broader availability will make it easier. I do wish that there was, right now, if you want to read comics on, say, your iPad or something like that, your options are to download the apps from the publishers or to use Comixology at Amazon. And I kind of wish that there was another alternative there. Not everybody wants to give their money to Amazon. And when you're looking at the publisher apps, I mean, that's great to have a DC app, but then you're not going to see Marvel stories or Image or Fantagraphics or drawing, any of this other stuff. And so I wish there was, when Comixology was its own thing, I thought that was great. And I wish there was something like that again, like an independent source of all comics electronically. And I know there's a couple little things here and there out there, but in general, to get your weekly comic fix electronically, you either have to go to a publisher app or to Amazon. And I'd like there to be another option.
I wish there was. Yeah, because with the Marvel and DC app, you pay a subscription to each of them. And so, like, personally, I have Comixology. And of course, the things that touch that app are usually 6 months out of date. And so you can't really stay up to date if you wanted to. But it's really good for reading the classics or whatever. And I find as a comic book reader, and I think it's with age too, I am so much more into trades than I am to the weekly thing. And my friends in the comic book industry or in the comic book shops have said, like, yeah, we're starting to see people go for trades more nowadays. So I wonder if there's a way to lean in on that or something like that. And if you guys are new to comics reading, the best thing you could do, my biggest advice, is go to your local comic shop, tell them what you're into. They'll find the book for you. And they know.
Yeah. A good comic book store will be able to go, oh, you like, I don't know. Now I'm blanking on everything. I don't know. You like Game of Thrones? Here's a comic that'll scratch that itch. You like, you like John Grisham? Here's a comic that'll scratch that itch. Whatever it is. We haven't quite hit the Japanese standard yet, where there's literally a comic book of every topic you can imagine. But over the past 20 years, there's a lot of subject matter out there that's available in comics.
And a big array of topics and difficulty too. Like there's some very mature comics and stuff. Like going back to Alan Moore and Watchmen. If you like a lot of text, more text than picture sometimes, then check out Watchmen. It's a heck of a read. But yeah, it's definitely dated. Let's get everybody pointed in the right direction. You have I Hunt Killers, a prequel coming out. Can you give a quick synopsis to what that is and where people can find it?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the I Hunt Killers series came out a few years back. And what I had done was, between the books coming out, I had done these short stories online, which were these prequel stories about the characters, sort of just getting into things that I couldn't get into in the books. There wasn't room to get into in the books. And there were a couple short stories and there were a couple of novellas. And people really loved them, but they kept emailing me and saying, hey, I want these in print. And I was like, well, you can't publish a 30-page thing in print. Like, there's no way to make money at that, blah, blah, blah. But for like 10 years, people kept bugging me about it. And finally, dummy that I am, I realized, well, I could just do it as an anthology. I could combine them all together into an anthology, add a new story that nobody's ever seen before, and I could do this anthology. And I went to my publisher and I said, hey, why don't we do this? And they said, we'd love to, but anthologies are a really tough sale, and people don't like anthologies. I'm like, but people are asking for it. We went back and forth and they said, we're going to pass. So I had my Thanos at the end of Age of Ultron moment where I said, fine, I'll do it myself. And I put the book out there, and it's called Before the Hunt, and it is the prequels. It's 7 different stories of varying lengths, focusing on different characters from the trilogy and things that happened to them before the trilogy. And I'm really happy with it. And I think there's some really good stories in there. One of them is the single most disturbing story I have ever written. And I've written some really, really brutal and rough stuff in my career, man. But this story that I wrote in this anthology is like, I read it and I went, oh, I am going straight to hell. Like, there is no saving throw. Like, when I die, straight to hell.
No saving throw. I love it.
No. So that's in there, if you want to see what that's all about. But yeah, it's called, like I said, it's called Before the Hunt. It's out everywhere. It's bookshop.org, Amazon, Barnes and Noble, everywhere, all the usual places. And people can go to my website, barrylyga.com, to see more about it if they want.
So we'll have links to Before the Hunt, and then we'll also have links to your website because it's a really good place to see your complete body of work. Barry, thank you so much for joining me today. It's been a great pleasure talking to you.
Frank, this has been terrific. I really appreciate it.
That's great. All right, everybody. Again, follow those links in the description, and we'll talk to you guys next week. Bye.